All right, so we are back with Andrea Jenelle, who just read a sample of Spine of Steel, which is out this week as a new release and kicks off the Suffragette Uprising series. So before we get into this sample that you read, can you tell us, because you're the leader of our series, can you tell us about your vision and maybe the inspiration for it?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I've been a lifelong feminist is because my grandmother worked at the polls every year from 1931 until like 5 years before she died in 2012. So like 75 years she worked at the polls like every year. She was
Wow.
like a firm believer in women's right to vote because she saw that happen. She was born in 1911, so she saw her mother get to vote for the first time. So she was a strong believer in that. And having said all that, just seeing like what happened at the last election and seeing like a lot of the feedback that came out of that like a lot of people just didn't want to vote for a woman. And it to me it's the natural outcome, right, of the journey that we've been on as women, as suffragists, to have a woman in the highest elected position in this country. I feel like sometimes we forget our history. I don't know that the new generation coming up is as aware of this legacy of like all these women who have been fighting for these rights for 400, 500 years, right? So um I wanted to make that the centerpiece of a series. I thought it would be fun to do it as an interconnected series so that we're all like talking about different time periods and like different issues that women have faced throughout history, but all tied to this core belief that, you know, an equal opportunity.
I love that. Yeah, I grew up hearing about my great grandmother who served as a foreman on a jury, like the first year that women could vote, because once you vote, you become a jury member.
Yeah.
And, it's a wonderful story, but also, I also grew up being like, well, we won it. We have the right to vote. It's accomplished.
Hmm.
And so I think it's really important to remember, how did that happen? It was not inevitable, because nothing in history is inevitable.
Right.
And, what are the resonances with today that we can learn from or draw inspiration from, etc.
Exactly.
All right. So you mentioned at the top that this story is very interested in the Comstock Act.
Yes.
Would you like to give us a little infomercial about what that
So
is?
so the Comstock Act was basically federal legislation that was passed in the late 19th century that allowed the banning of what it deemed to be pornographic material. And the Comstock Act was focused on the distribution of that material through the US mail service. So it kind of fell out of favor, like as being enforced, like around the 1930s. I think that's when the last case was prosecuted, but it was never taken off the books or revoked. So that law is still on the books. It's funny that we're having this conversation now because one of the things that the Comstock Act talks about is that every community can determine on its own what it deems to be pornographic or licentious. So every community has that power to do that, which is why like a lot of this, which is why a lot of book bans happen on the local level, right? Because it's that community that's determining that. It's also why there are some states now that are proposing this like a much broader ban on books than what has ever been contemplated before. I think Oklahoma is one of the states right now that is going through that. And romance falls into that category. The thing is that the way the original law was written had its limitations, right? So it talks about the US mail service. Well, as we know, like that doesn't contemplate digital books. Are you going to say that US mail service includes email addresses, like downloading a book from a website? So I don't know if, depending on what happens, if that'll like affect that. There's also the fact that like I know just in my state, there are three romance bookstores. That is all they sell is romance. And I feel like there's been this rise since the pandemic of these romance bookstores popping up everywhere. And it's like, how is that going to, and most of them are women owned. So how is that going to affect that side of commerce too? Because that's a small business. And yeah,
Right.
there's all kinds of ramifications and repercussions to this act and what happens with the states. And as you know, like some once someone challenges something is unconstitutional, which I think is the goal, it can move all the way up to Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court determines the standard, right? Which is
Right.
applicable everywhere. So yeah,
Right.
it's
And I know there's also a Supreme Court ruling called the Miller test that
yes. Yep.
instructs communities on how to consider is
Mm-hmm.
something licentious or
Yes.
pornographic, and it needs to be considered as a whole. Does it
Mm-hmm.
have literary or artistic merit? And
Right.
most of the book bans are literally trying to remove that part of the consideration. So, as romance readers,
Mm-hmm.
we know what the whole literary or artistic value is. And that's why we
Right.
have bookstores about it. That's why we have podcasts about
Exactly.
it. That's why we have communities around it. And so we do need to stand up and say, hey, this is not okay. This is how
Yeah.
we consider what is appropriate for our community or not.
Right. And I think, I know we've talked about the history, right, of romance period. And like, the well, we'll just start with Kathleen Woodiwiss, right? Because when Flame in the Flower came out in 1971, that was the first time that there was like what was considered explicit acts on the page. And remember, that was also when the women's rights movement was taking off too, right? Like the Equal Rights Amendment and like all these things were happening. So I'm sure that was an outcome of that. But we've also got to consider, like, I even know my mother, like, she did not want to teach us about sex ed. Right? Like,
Right.
so it was more like, oh, I have to read a romance to get that information. So I feel like it's also an educational thing for women. And it's also a way for women to explore their sexuality that they can't in any other way, especially if your sexuality is part of a marginalized community, right? Yeah. So.